My blind uncle's wife makes a shocking final confession. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. There was no drunk driver, Nina, Celia whispered, turning her face toward the hospice room window like she couldn't bear to aim those words at me directly. I reached for the wheel. For a second, all I heard was the oxygen concentrator humming by her bed and the soft rattle in her chest. Arthur had been dead 9 days. We had buried him on a Thursday under a gray spring sky, with half the town talking about what a good man he'd been and the other half talking about what a saint Celia was for caring for him after the accident took his sight. I had stood there in my black dress, nodding through casseroles and condolences, believing the same story I'd believed since I was 2 years old. My name is Nina. I'm 29, and my Uncle Arthur was the safest person in my childhood. He had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, even after he lost his eyes to darkness. He never reached out blindly and helplessly the way people assumed. He moved carefully, counting steps, finding chair backs with the side of his hand, tapping his cane once against hardwood before turning. When I was little, I thought he had a private map of the world inside his head. Celia had always been attached to that map. She guided him by the elbow, read his mail aloud, answered questions before he finished asking them. Everyone called it devotion. At church, women used words like faithful and steadfast. If Arthur thanked her in public, people got misty-eyed. I did too. So when she said she had caused the crash that blinded him, my first instinct was an outrage. It was refusal. My mind rejected it the way a tongue rejects spoiled milk. You're confused, I told her, even though my skin had already gone cold. She gave a dry little laugh. No, I've been clear for days. That's the punishment. Then she lifted one trembling hand and touched the blanket near her waist, where something small made a sharp shape under the fabric. Then Celia said the one thing Arthur had never lived to hear. If you had only known Arthur and Celia from the outside, you would have believed in them the way people believe in old wedding photos. Their house sat at the end of Maple Lane, white siding, deep porch, wind chimes that clicked softly in every season. Arthur liked order. Even after the accident, the hallway runner stayed perfectly straight. The mugs were always on the second shelf, and the jar of sugar never moved from the right side of the stove because he remembered the kitchen by touch. Celia presented all of it as proof that she had preserved his dignity. Arthur likes things done the way he remembers them, she'd say, smoothing some imaginary wrinkle in the room. Routine keeps him calm. Maybe that was true, but routine also made it easier for her to control what reached him. She screened every call. She stood behind his chair at doctor appointments and answered before he could. If somebody visited unannounced, she'd smile in that polished way of hers and say, "He's tired today." Even when I could hear Arthur's voice in the den asking who was there. She never sounded harsh, which almost made it worse. Control wrapped in softness is harder to call out. As a kid, I missed most of that. I saw the sweeter parts. Arthur letting me trace the raised dots in his Braille cookbook. Arthur tapping the porch rail and telling me rain sounded different depending on how much the roses needed it. Arthur asking me to describe sunsets in embarrassing detail because, as he put it, most people are lazy with beauty. Celia always hovered nearby, correcting my wording like she was editing Arthur's reality in real time. Not orange, Nina. More peach. He likes accurate descriptions. There were moments that pricked at me even then. Once, when I was 13, Arthur reached toward the ringing phone and Celia got there first. He smiled and said, "Let me guess. Diane again." Celia went still for half a beat. "Telemarketer," she said, and hung up without saying hello. Arthur turned his face toward the sound of her voice. Thought I heard Diane's laugh. "You hear what you want sometimes," she said lightly, then changed the subject so fast I barely noticed. Years later, that memory returned the moment I found the missing key. The older I got, the more little things started collecting in me like lint in a pocket. Not dramatic enough to make a scene over, just uncomfortable enough to remember later. Arthur would start a story and Celia would redirect it before he reached the part she didn't like. If he mentioned old coworkers, she would say they'd all moved on. If he asked whether Mark had called, she'd answer, "I told you, he's busy," in the tone people use with children and the elderly and anyone they've decided shouldn't have the full truth. Mark, their son, copied her without realizing it. He loved his father, I think, But he spoke around him instead of to him, like blindness had turned Arthur into furniture with feelings. One Christmas, I brought Arthur a recording of an audiobook player with oversized buttons. He ran his fingers over it and grinned. Now this is a thoughtful gift. Before he could set it on the side table, Celia said, "That's sweet, Nina, but new systems overwhelm him." Arthur's smile flattened. "I didn't say that." "No, but I live with you," she replied, almost singing it. "I know what tires you out." Another time, when I was 21, I found 3 envelopes tucked into the slot of the grandfather clock in the front hall. All were addressed to Arthur in thick black marker. One was from a regional center for adaptive living. One was from a lawyer's office in Cedar Falls. One had no return address at all. I handed them to Celia because that still felt normal then. She took them too quickly. "Oh, these are old. Junk, mostly." Arthur heard the paper. "Mail. Coupons and medical nonsense," she answered. He frowned. "Read it anyway." She never did. She carried the envelopes into the kitchen, and when I passed the trash later, the torn corners were sitting under coffee grounds. I should have said something. I didn't. In families like ours, silence was disguised as politeness. Celia did so much. Arthur depended on her. Mark worshipped her. And I was the niece who came by twice a month and thought she knew things. Still, by the time Arthur died, I had a quiet list in my head. Cut off phone calls, missing letters, canceled visits, whole subjects that tightened Celia's mouth the moment they came up. I just never imagined the list would start with a lie about the crash. 3 days after the funeral, Celia pressed a brass key into my hand. The key was warm from being hidden under her blanket. Small, old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to open a diary or a jewelry box. Celia folded my fingers over it with surprising strength. "In the sewing room," she said. "Bottom cabinet. Blue tin behind the patterns." I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Her lips were dry. She wet them and tried again. "I told everyone a truck ran the light. There was no truck. Arthur and I were fighting. He said he wanted to go to Des Moines for rehab after the hospital. He said he couldn't spend the rest of his life being looked after." Her throat worked around the words. I grabbed the wheel because I was angry. That's all it took. I felt my pulse in my teeth. "That's not possible," I said. He would have known. He woke up confused. Head injury, morphine, surgeries. He remembered rain and glass and my screaming. She shut her eyes. I gave him the rest. I gave everybody the rest. I should have walked out. Instead, I stood there, frozen, because something in her voice had the flatness of fact. Not drama, not self-pity, just inventory. "There was a specialist," she said. "A transfer option. Maybe not a miracle, but a chance. They wanted him moved quickly. I told them he was exhausted. I said he wanted to stay local. I signed for him while he was sedated." Her hand twitched against the sheet. "He kept asking why no one from the university called back. I told him they'd reviewed his file and said there was nothing to do." The room tipped sideways. "You're lying," I whispered, but I was already hearing every old interruption, every vanished envelope, every time she'd spoken over him. "I hid letters," she went on. "I told people he didn't want visitors. I told him people stopped trying. Then I spent 27 years being praised for the cage I built." "Why tell me now?" Her eyes finally met mine. "Because Arthur loved you enough to trust what you do with the truth. And because Mark won't." I opened my mouth, but she had already turned away, staring at the window again like she was listening for a car that never stopped at the intersection outside. When I left hospice, the key felt heavier than my phone. By sunset, I was parked outside their house, shaking too hard to drive. I sat in my car on Maple Lane with the engine off and my phone recording into the dark because I suddenly didn't trust my own memory. Celia said there was no drunk driver. I whispered into the voice memo. She said she grabbed the wheel. She said there was a specialist. She said she signed something while Arthur was sedated. Hearing it back made it sound cleaner than it had felt in the room. In the room, it had felt like the floor opening. I called Mark because part of me still wanted someone to say there was an explanation that didn't destroy Arthur's whole life. He picked up on the fourth ring, already irritated. "If this is about Mom, I'm at the pharmacy." "She confessed something," I said. A pause. Then, "She's on pain meds. She said there was no other car." He exhaled so hard I could hear his jaw tighten. "Nina, do not do this. Dad just died." "So that makes it better?" "It makes it cruel," he snapped. "People say ugly things when they're scared. She carried him for decades. She changed his bandages. She drove him everywhere. She gave up everything. The phrase hit me because it was the same phrase everyone used. Gave up everything. As if sacrifice erased power. As if devotion canceled damage. She gave me a key, I said quietly. Mark went silent. Not confused. Silent. What key? I asked. I don't know what you think you're chasing, he said after a second, voice flatter now. But if you start digging through their house right after Dad's funeral, you're going to regret it. Then he hung up. That silence bothered me more than the threat. If he thought his mother was rambling, why had the key bothered him? Why did he sound like a man trying to get ahead of a flood instead of a son protecting a dying woman? I ended up calling Diane, who had been Celia's hospice volunteer before she became almost a family friend. Diane was 58, practical, impossible to rattle, and one of the few people Arthur had always seemed genuinely relieved to hear. When I told her what Celia said, Diane didn't gasp. She just asked, "Did she give you anything else?" "A key." "Then go look," she said. Dying people confuse names. They rarely invent hardware. Inside the dark house, the sewing room door was already half open. The sewing room smelled like cedar, dust, and the faint medicinal sweetness of old hand lotion. Celia had kept it unnaturally neat, with pattern books stacked by decade and jars of buttons sorted by color. The bottom cabinet was locked. The brass key fit on the first try. Behind folded fabric and 2 dented tins of Christmas ornaments sat a blue recipe box with peeling gold trim. My hands were clumsy by then. I almost dropped it dragging it into the light. Inside were papers, not recipes. Envelopes bundled with rubber bands, bank statements, legal copies, a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, and a manila folder from St. Luke's Regional Hospital dated June 1999, the month of Arthur's accident. The first thing I pulled out was an unopened letter from the Iowa Vision Rehabilitation Center, addressed to Mr. Arthur Bell, stamped final follow-up. The second was a transfer request form from the hospital. Patient recommended for urgent retinal trauma consultation. Under declined by family representative was Celia's signature. I sat down hard on the floor. There were more. A letter from a lawyer about an insurance settlement. A stack of monthly statements from an account Arthur had never mentioned, with transfers moving in precise amounts into a joint account Celia controlled. Notes written in Celia's tight, slanted handwriting. Do not mention Cedar Falls call. Tell Arthur Mark handled taxes. Mail back brochure. Then I found something worse than paperwork. 3 envelopes that had been opened and resealed, each addressed to Arthur in different handwriting. One from an old teaching colleague. One from a friend named Ellis. One from Diane, years before I knew her well. None had been read to him. None had been given to him. Celia had written dates on the backs in pencil, like she was cataloging what she was taking. At the bottom of the box was a police supplement report I had never seen. The family story had always been simple. Rain, intersection, drunk driver fleeing the scene. But the supplement didn't mention another vehicle at all. It mentioned skid marks, a roadside witness, and possible passenger interference prior to impact. My mouth went dry enough to hurt. Then the cassette case slipped open, and I saw Arthur's handwriting on the label. I knew that voice would break whatever denial I had left. I took everything to Diane's kitchen because I couldn't stand being alone with it in the house. She spread the papers across her table the way some women lay out sewing patterns, flattening each page with calm, capable hands while I paced. This signature here, she said, tapping the hospital transfer form, isn't Arthur's normal hand. It's guided. See how the letters drag? Someone either helped him sign or signed while holding his wrist. I thought of Arthur's pride. The way he insisted on labeling his own spice jars in Braille, even when it took him forever. The idea of Celia steering his hand across a paper that cost him his future made me feel physically sick. We built the timeline slowly. June 12th, 1999, crash. June 13th, surgery to stabilize internal injuries. June 14th, university ophthalmology consult recommended. June 15th, transfer declined by spouse. June 18th, initial insurance contact. By August, settlement discussions. By September, Arthur discharged home. By December, the first brochure from the Vision Rehab Center arrived. It had been opened and hidden. You know what the ugliest part is? Diane asked. I looked up from a bank statement. It worked because she mixed real care with control. She probably did bathe him. Probably did learn every medication, every route through the house, every warning sign. That's what makes people excuse the rest. The letters filled in what the dates couldn't. Ellis wrote that he had called several times, but Celia says you don't want to talk to old coworkers. Arthur's former principal wrote that the district would hold a consulting role if he wanted it. Diane's old letter offered rides to adaptive training twice a week if transportation was the problem. Arthur never answered any of them because Arthur never saw them. And then there was the money. The settlement wasn't millionaire money, but it was enough to matter. $312,400 over 2 disbursements. Mortgage arrears disappeared within months. So did Mark's credit card judgment. So did a loan tied to Celia's failed craft store. Arthur's name was on the account. The transfers were made online under a power of attorney document dated 2 years later, signed with the same dragging, guided hand. All those years, the town saw a loyal wife keeping a blind man's life together. On paper, I saw a woman narrowing his world until dependence looked natural. Then Diane slid the witness statement toward me, and the whole story got narrower. The witness had heard Celia screaming before the car ever hit the guardrail. The witness was a woman named Patricia Sloan who had been waiting at the bus stop half a block from the intersection. Her statement was buried as a supplement because nobody died and because the investigating officer apparently accepted the version that mattered most to the people standing at the wreck. I heard a woman shout, "Don't you leave me," just before the vehicle veered, Patricia wrote. Passenger appeared to lunge right. I did not observe a second car. I read that line 5 times. It matched the way Celia had told it in hospice. Arthur saying he wanted rehab in Des Moines, maybe more independence than she could control, maybe even a life not centered entirely around her. She grabbed the wheel. Rain did the rest. But the deeper cruelty was in the hospital folder. Arthur's trauma to both eyes had been severe, but not hopeless in those first 48 hours. A consulting note said his best chance depended on rapid transfer to a university specialist. Another note, written after, stated, "Spouse reports patient wishes to recover locally and declines transfer." A third note, almost an afterthought, read, "Patient tearful, asking whether the big hospital ever called back." He had asked. He had known enough to ask. I thought of all the times Arthur had dismissed his own disappointment with a shrug and a joke. "Guess the world kept spinning without me," he'd say. I had always heard wisdom in that. Now I heard training. A man learning to live inside someone else's edits. There was one more letter in the blue tin that punched the air out of me. It was from the State School for the Blind, dated a year after the crash, inviting Arthur to interview for a teaching position in adaptive music. Someone had written in the margin, in Celia's handwriting, "Absolutely not. He can't manage travel. Don't encourage fantasies." Arthur had once told me he missed teaching more than he missed driving. I remembered the way his hand lingered on the piano lid in the church basement, his fingers still perfect on chords he couldn't see. Celia hadn't just trapped him after the accident. She had kept choosing the smaller version of his life, over and over, whenever the larger one tried to reach him. When I confronted her again, she didn't deny any of it. She only told me why, and that was somehow worse. Celia was weaker the second time I went to hospice, but her mind was brutally clear. I set the copied documents on the tray table in front of her and watched her eyes move over the papers like she was checking that the damage had finally surfaced. "You hid the transfer," I said. "You hid the rehab program, the teaching job, letters from friends. You told him the world stopped calling." She looked at the ceiling. "The world did stop calling eventually. Because you answered for him." She closed her eyes. At first, yes. I wanted to hate her cleanly. It would have made things easier. But she didn't plead innocence or collapse into theatrics. She just kept speaking in the exhausted voice of someone who had spent decades holding a story shut with both hands. "Before the crash, Arthur was already pulling away from me," she said. "Not because he was cruel, because he was waking up. He wanted more than our little life, more than my needs. Rehab was going to take him out of the house, around other people, into rooms where I wasn't necessary." She swallowed. "Do you know how shame twists love?" I was terrified he'd recover enough to see exactly who I was. "Who were you?" "A woman with debt, a son in trouble, and a husband whose kindness kept showing me what I lacked." That line stayed with me because it was the first true thing about her that wasn't self-flattering. She had loved Arthur, I think, just not in a way that could survive his freedom. Her care was real. So were the pill schedules, the rides, the sleepless nights, the careful meals. But each act of care fed the structure of dependence she had built from guilt and fear. I told myself I was protecting him from disappointment, she said. Then I realized how useful disappointment was. A person who expects less asks less. I asked whether Mark knew. Not the beginning, she said. Later enough. Then she coughed so hard the nurse had to come in. By the time the room settled, Celia had turned her face back to the window and would only say one more thing. Check the recipe box divider labeled winter, she whispered. What I found there made the money impossible to explain away. Behind the divider labeled winter was a second stack, thinner and newer. Tax records, property documents, power of attorney renewals, copies of checks. Arthur's name sat on every page like a person who had been invited into a room only after all the decisions were made. Diane and I went through them line by line. The first insurance payout after the crash had covered medical expenses and modifications to the house. The second, larger settlement, $184,000 after fees, should have sat as a cushion for Arthur's future care, mobility training, transportation, whatever independence still looked possible. Instead, within 18 months, chunks of it had disappeared into mortgage reinstatement, Celia's business debts, and a private loan that kept Mark out of court after a failed landscaping venture in his 20s. When Arthur signed the power of attorney years later, he probably believed he was making routine life easier. By then, Celia had spent too long narrating the world for him to question every page she put under his hand. There were also notes, little private scripts she wrote herself. If Arthur asks about balance, say long-term care is expensive. Do not let bank speak directly, confuses him. Mail statements to box, not house. That last note led to a rented post office box still active under Celia's name. Inside were more letters, including one from Arthur's sister in Arizona, written 12 years ago, begging him to call because she had gotten him approved for a mobility scholarship in Phoenix. Another from a volunteer driver network. Another from Patricia Sloan, the bus stop witness, saying she had tried to correct the police record, but your wife told me revisiting details would traumatize you. Every offer of help had been intercepted before it could become choice. At the very bottom of the box was the cassette player Arthur used for notes when his hands hurt. On one tape, dated years after the crash, his voice filled Diane's kitchen in a low, patient murmur. Sometimes, he said, I think the silence in this house is being arranged for me. I had to stop the tape because I started crying too hard to hear the rest. The next person I confronted was the one still trying to protect her. Mark met me at the house because I told him I had found financial records. He came in angry, shoulders locked, car still running in the driveway like he meant to leave fast. I laid out the bank statements, the post office box paperwork, the scholarship letters, the transfer form, and finally the witness statement. For the first minute, he tried outrage. You broke into my parents' private papers. Your mother gave me the key. She was dying. And your father was blind. That landed. He looked away first. I asked him whether he knew Celia had diverted Arthur's settlement money. He rubbed a hand over his mouth and said, I knew she moved things around. Dad trusted her. Knew or asked. He didn't answer. Then I asked if he knew there had been no drunk driver. His head snapped up so sharply it was answer enough. Not full knowledge. Shock. Yes, but not total ignorance either. Something adjacent. What did she tell you? I pressed. Mark sat down hard at the table and stared at the wood grain. She said the report was messy, he muttered. That witnesses got confused. That dad blaming a phantom truck was kinder than him knowing she panicked. He laughed once, bitter and short. I thought that was the worst of it. The transfer, the letters, the money. He covered his face. I knew about some money. I didn't know about the specialist. That was the first honest thing he said to me. He told me Celia had used Arthur's accounts for years in ways she called temporary and necessary. Mortgage, repairs, his business bailout, tax messes, always with the promise she'd make it right later. Mark had accepted it because Arthur seemed calm, because the house stayed intact, because everyone in town kept praising Celia for holding the family together. If a lie is repeated in public long enough, even the people profiting from it start calling it duty. She loved him, Mark said, and his voice broke on the word loved. I know, I said. That's what makes this unforgivable. 2 days later, Celia died before dawn. And that afternoon, the estate lawyer called us both into his office. The lawyer's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Mark arrived looking wrecked, still in the same black sport coat from the funeral circuit. I brought a folder so full it barely closed. Diane came with me, not as family, but as a witness to Celia's confession and the papers I'd found. At first, the meeting was routine. Arthur's old will, Celia's recent revisions, house, savings, personal property. Then the lawyer slid forward a list of accounts and asked whether either of us knew about a post office box and 2 transfers made after Arthur's death, but before Celia's. Mark blinked. What transfers? I opened my folder. What happened next wasn't dramatic in the movie sense. No one flipped a table. No one screamed on cue. It was worse than that. Slow, undeniable, procedural. I laid out the hospital transfer refusal, the police supplement, the witness statement, the letters, the account trail. Then I played the hospice recording from my phone. There was no drunk driver, Nina. I reached for the wheel. Nobody moved while her voice filled that office. The lawyer took off his glasses. Mark stared at the desk like if he kept his eyes low enough the evidence might turn back into paper and stop being his life. When I played the second clip, Celia admitting she hid Arthur's mail and told him people stopped calling, Mark made a sound I had never heard from another adult. Not quite a sob, not quite anger, something collapsing internally. The lawyer's tone changed after that. He stopped calling the documents family matters and started calling them fiduciary concerns. He said the power of attorney might be challengeable. He said certain transfers could be clawed back into the estate. He said if the police report had been materially distorted, there were limits to what could be done now, but fraud tied to assets was another issue. Mark finally looked at me then, face blotched and raw. Are you trying to bury her? No, I said. I'm trying to stop her from burying Arthur twice. By the time we left, the estate was frozen pending review. A week later, the courthouse steps felt colder than the funeral ever had. Once paperwork starts moving, grief loses its softness. It becomes deadlines, affidavits, certified copies, return calls. Arthur's death had been casseroles and hymns. Celia's truth was bank subpoenas, probate notices, and town gossip so polite it somehow felt filthier than open cruelty. The estate review uncovered enough to rip the family apart in practical ways. The house couldn't transfer cleanly to Mark because too many funds looked commingled. Several old withdrawals were protected by time or too muddy to reverse, but recent account movements made after Arthur's death were pulled back. The lawyer petitioned to redirect a portion of what remained according to an older version of Arthur's will. The one written before Celia had isolated him from half the people who loved him. Mark called it humiliation. I called it arithmetic. Church women who had praised Celia's devotion stopped making eye contact with me in the grocery store. One of them actually said, "Some truths help no one," while reaching for canned peaches. As if Arthur's stolen choices were a breach in their comfort more than his life. As if the version of Celia they admired mattered more than the one Arthur lived under. Mark and I barely spoke except through lawyers. When we did, he oscillated between fury and pleading. "You could have handled this privately," he told me once. "Private is how she got away with it," I said. That didn't make me feel clean. It made me feel tired. I missed Arthur in a different, uglier way now. Not just his presence, but the years he should have had bigger, fuller, louder. I felt guilty for every envelope I had handed back to Celia, every visit I had accepted being cut short, every time I had mistaken her management for love. Then Diane called and said the lawyer had released one personal storage box that didn't affect the estate. Arthur's tapes, notebooks, and old braille labels. When I opened it, there was one item on top addressed to me. Arthur had left behind his own version of the story. The envelope had my name written in block letters Arthur used when he wanted sighted people to read, without help. Inside was a cassette tape, a short braille note Diane translated for me, and one of the recipe cards he used as bookmarks because he liked the stiff paper. The braille note said only, "For Nina, if I go first. Play alone." I sat in my car outside the cemetery because I couldn't think of anywhere else private enough. His voice came through the old tape hissy and warm, like he was sitting in the passenger seat with his hands folded over his cane. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then I was right about 2 things. First, that you'd look more closely than the rest of us. Second, that I waited too long to ask you to." I had to pause the tape and breathe. When I started it again, Arthur explained that he had never known the full truth about the crash or the hospital. But over the years he had suspected that Celia was narrowing information before it reached him. He said he noticed how often news arrived pre-softened, how many people disappeared only in ways that required her voice to explain them. Dependence makes cowards of people who were not born that way, he said quietly. Not because we lose our minds, because we learn what questioning costs the ones we rely on. That sentence broke me more than Celia's confession ever had. He had seen the shape of the cage without seeing its construction. He had sensed the missing pieces but weighed them against daily survival, against peace, against the fatigue of forcing truth out of the person who dressed your wounds and led you through doorways. He said he loved Celia. He said he also feared the version of gratitude that turns into silence. He said if I ever found proof of anything larger, I was not to protect anyone's reputation at the expense of reality. Then the tape clicked, and there was one last line, spoken so softly I almost missed it. I hope the people who loved me learned the difference between help and possession. I sat there with the engine off until dusk, listening to the graveyard birds settle into the trees and realizing Arthur had spent years understanding more than any of us gave him credit for. What haunted me most was how carefully he had tried to prepare me. It has been 11 months since Celia's confession, and Maple Lane looks smaller now. The house was sold. Part of the remaining estate funded services Arthur had once been denied: mobility training, audio equipment, transportation vouchers through a local blindness nonprofit. That was the lawyer's idea first, then mine, then eventually even Mark's, though he never admitted it as agreement. We still don't talk the way cousins should. Maybe we never will. Grief that gets mixed with evidence rarely softens into anything tidy. I still think about Celia in ways that make me uncomfortable. Not with forgiveness exactly, and not with simple hatred either. She was not a monster in the useful, distant sense. She was a human being who mixed love, fear, shame, guilt, and need until she could no longer tell care from control. People like that are dangerous precisely because they can point to real sacrifice. They did show up. They did lift, wash, drive, manage, soothe. But they also decided, filtered, intercepted, and rewrote. The good acts become camouflage for the theft. That is what I wish more families understood. A person can be devoted and still be controlling. A caregiver can be exhausted, generous, and manipulative in the same body. Applause from the outside proves almost nothing. If someone depends on one person for information, money, access, transport, medication, and social contact, then trust is not enough. There has to be transparency. There have to be second eyes, direct conversations, separate mail, independent advice, and moments where the person being cared for gets to speak without their helper translating them. When I visit Arthur now, I bring coffee and sit by his stone and describe the weather the way he taught me. Accurately, not lazily. Last week the sky really was peach at the edges. I told him that. I told him I was sorry I didn't ask harder questions sooner. I told him I finally understood what he meant about the silence in that house being arranged.